Good morning. My name is Matt Tice. I'm the Chief Executive of Insurgence Group, and today I'm going to share our webinar on the Insurgent Mindset, which is a companion to the Insurgent Mindset podcast that we've recently launched. And what I'm going to do is take an opportunity just to share some of the core ideas of the Insurgent Mindset with you today and give you an opportunity to interact as we go through, perhaps sharing thoughts in the chat. So I'll jump right in and talk a little bit about Insurgence Group, which is a small but growing global management consulting firm focused on disruption and change, particularly where strategy and innovation come together. So that's kind of what we're famous for. And we have offices here in Sydney, where I'm at today, and in Paris and New York. And we're here in our ninth year, kind of now graduating into our 10th year as a firm. We do a lot of different types of work, but traditionally our work would fall into three main buckets, which I would describe as general strategy with a particular focus on growth, and general innovation with a particular focus on particularly customer innovation and business model innovation. But that obviously is a broad church. And we also do a fair amount of work in the area of leadership, particularly in this area around helping leaders and executives to develop and nurture the insurgent mindset. And I guess all these things kind of come together. And some of the work that we do is very bespoke. But my details are here if you want to follow up after the session. And I mentioned a moment ago, we've recently launched the Insurgent Mindset podcast, which has both been a lot of fun to share perspectives on different facets of the challenger mindset, if you can use that as a proxy for the insurgent mindset. And we've done, I think, 5 episodes now. 3 are available. One, we've done a great episode on the U.S. election, talking about that through a disruption lens. We've done an introductory podcast. We just launched a podcast last week focused on the sort of the contrast between NVIDIA and Intel, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Another podcast that'll be coming out next week focused on taking a deep dive on Boeing and looking at the contrast between Boeing and the insurgent competitor SpaceX. And this morning, we just taped a new podcast focused on disruption in pharmacy. So if you're interested and you want to hear more about this topic, the schedule for the Insurgent Mindset podcast is every fortnight. So look forward to new episodes there, and it's available on Spotify, Apple, and on YouTube. Okay, so let me start off by just sort of setting the table here. What is insurgence? And we've sort of coined this term about a decade ago, and largely the way we think about insurgence is how do you bottle up the essence of the challenger firm? So that sort of encompasses the mindsets and risk appetite and philosophy around how you compete, alternative or challenger business models, et cetera, which kind of all comes into a broad way of thinking about how to innovate competition, how you compete as a firm, thinking differently about the behaviors and the mindsets required to be able to nurture the challenger approach to disruption and change in an industry or in a firm. And we found these concepts to be very successful in terms of giving firms and business leaders a fresh look at how to compete and how to think about how their businesses engage with the market, consumers, customers, et cetera. So that's been a very successful frame for us. But I think the big challenge with regard to insurgents, and in particular the insurgent mindset, is that the incumbent mindset, sort of the 180 degrees alternative to the insurgent mindset, is the norm. And the reality for that is that we as human beings seek safety in terms of we like equilibrium. We don't particularly like change. There's a term for that called homeostasis, which is largely almost a regression to the mean, or the idea that any system will seek a sort of a negative feedback loop, which drives to a stable equilibrium. And of course, organizations, firms, if you will, are no different than organisms in a sense that this sort of safety is deeply hard-coded into how we manage ourselves. So in order to make that change and change the equilibrium, it generally takes a very significant shift in terms of either a deliberate and intentional projection of we want to do things differently, or an existential or significant external crisis or change that requires us as incumbents to change. So it is very difficult to drive that shift, but increasingly as cycle times reduce with the advent of AI, with all the macro political change in the environment, we're forced as business leaders to front up to these challenges, and often because competitors are so these challenger competitors are so well funded and so aggressive, uh, incumbents in particular industries are often caught unawares and unable to compete, uh, and therefore disruption becomes more and more the norm. So, in order to overcome this homeostatic sort of approach, we have to be very aware of our collective mindset and our individual leadership mindset that drives how we compete and how we think about how we engage with the world around us. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it is necessary to start to nurture a collective mindset, which is really all about seeking new opportunity and defending against disruption and change as the world changes more and more quickly. So what I thought I'd do is we entitled the webinar sort of 8 ways to nurture the insurgent mindset. So we ended up with a longer list than 8, but you'll bear with me. But what I want to do is just sort of call out some of the main characteristics of insurgents and the insurgent mindset. And I just want to make it very clear that it does require a bit of a break from the pack mentality in order to sort of nurture this mindset, which, as I mentioned before, can be both challenging and the default of most organizations and firms is to seek safety and incumbency. So let me just illustrate some of these things, which kind of come out of a lot of our research and studying companies that are doing disrupting and have been disrupted, and sort of discovering what are some of these common characteristics. So, first, I think inevitably the role of the incumbent tends to be to try to create a stable business model and extrapolate as much value from that business model as possible. And that ends up meaning that seeking additional value from a stable model works particularly well in a situation where the environment, particularly the competitive environment, is very stable, but that doesn't feel like the world that we live in today. Inevitably, the change and the pace of change is so high that it opens up lots of opportunities for insurgent challengers to undermine the business models of existing incumbents, whether that be some of the classic examples where technology has played a big role in disrupting many of our legacy sort of old economy industries, but now we're seeing this broadly across the whole economy, particularly with, as I mentioned before, the advent of AI and platform business models, which are fundamentally disruptive. So from a strategy point of view, the insurgent will tend to look at the market, look at the competition, look at the engagement or the experience of value with customers very differently, and create strategies deliberately designed to undermine, sort of the core playbooks of the incumbent. So I think that's really important. And we say here that you don't want to play chess when your competitor's playing Go, but increasingly we're finding that more and more insurgents with better funding and certainly a different relationship with risk are playing a different game. So that's number 1 on my list. The second is industry boundaries. I think the rule of the incumbent is, as I said before, to seek safety, and some of that safety comes from, well-defined and perhaps um, extremely um, non-pliable industry boundaries. So we gave my colleague Rondo Moses and I were talking this morning about pharmacy and the many changes in the healthcare ecosystem with regard to the bleeding of boundaries in terms of what business are we in? Are we a pharmacy? Are we a frontline healthcare organization? Are we a distribution company? Are we a last mile company, and so forth? And typically, in an industry where there's a high degree of equilibrium, those boundaries become very delineated. And of course, the insurgent or the challenger mindset is to ignore those boundaries or to significantly undermine or break down those boundaries, those walls, if you will, in a particular industry, which then opens an opportunity to redefine competition and perhaps redefine also what a particular industry means. And we've seen that happen in everything from taxis to airlines to healthcare and virtually everything in between, where your competitor of yesterday is not the same as your competitor of the future. So if you're an accounting firm really largely worried about other accounting firms, you need to open up your eyes and realize that much of the new value is being captured by platform companies or tech companies offering some of your traditional services in quite different ways, which really requires us to open up our mindset beyond kind of existing established boundaries in industries. So I think that's really important also. Of course, the incumbents do get disrupted, and the insurgents do the disrupting. Sometimes, not very often, however, sometimes the incumbents are able to mobilize to disrupt particular industries. A few examples come to mind, like Infosys or Microsoft, typically with a technology edge to them. The insurgents tend to do the disrupting. They have a much different relationship, as I mentioned before, with risk and their ability to engage the market in different ways, and aren't necessarily encumbered by the baggage that carries incumbents in terms of the way they look at the market, the way they look at competition, and so forth. And of course, incumbents have an incentive to leverage their incumbent advantage to erect barriers to insurgents, and again, as I mentioned before, extrapolate existing value paradigms, which makes it difficult to unravel all of that when the instability in the market kind of creates a situation where we need to find opportunities to change or to address disruption. So obviously, the insurgent carries the advantage of initiation of disruption, but achieving scale is very difficult sometimes for insurgents, and incumbents carry many advantages in terms of customer relationships and established supply chains and things like that. But the broad-based disruption is largely driven by firms that approach a market in a very different way, often or almost always at the expense of the incumbents. So disruption is a key factor. We find in the discipline of innovation, because incumbents are very extrapolative in terms of how they create value. What I mean by that is to extend and capitalize on existing assets, existing mindsets, positioning in the market, and so forth. The type of innovation prioritized by incumbents tends to be very much product innovation, which is all about seeking largely not necessarily new products, but product extensions or additional features that sort of extend existing platforms into the future, but also about processes, which are the type of innovation that goes into how you compete within an existing model better, faster, cheaper, or more efficiently and productively. So that these two areas of innovation are very comfortable in the inside out sort of oriented incumbent, whereas the insurgent will tend to prioritize different types of innovation where they're looking at primarily how to innovate business models, and business models are you can think of them as recipes for how value is created, and particularly how that value is expressed to consumers, customers, members, and so forth. But also the innovation of experiences and interactions at the frontier between the company and the customer and the consumer. So that that investment in innovation to discover new ways to express that value is a very different way to approach innovation that is deeply hard coded into the incumbent and the incumbent mindset. The insurgent and the insurgent mindset, whereas the incumbent likes to extend and capitalize on previous investments and, of course, improve existing processes. So that's a very different mindset and creates significantly different results. And we find that, in particular on the innovation of business models, the the insurgent firm will be very focused on undermining the recipe for how value is created in an incumbent industry, often or always to the disadvantage of the incumbent. So that's a key element to the insurgent mindset as well. Over the last sort of decade or so, there's a lot of innovation in marketing in particular, and the idea of sort of journey mapping everything and really understanding how to engage, particularly customers, but also internally with employees, at all the different touch points a firm has with their customers is something that's undergone a bit of a revolution. But what we find is that most incumbents live in a very process-oriented viewpoint in terms of these touch points, seeking to improve the experience at existing touch points, which, while necessary, is not sufficient in terms of discovering new sources of value. And the insurgent will prioritize identification and nurturing of alternative touch points where incumbents aren't necessarily engaging with customers. And firms like Nike have done a great job at sort of reinventing how they engage with customers, although they've ebbed and flowed over the years. Lego is another great example. McDonald's, many insurgent sort of competitors are seeking to find completely alternative ways to engage or indeed co-create with customers, where insurgent incumbents tend to be much more focused on transactional value in terms of how consumers or customers realize or understand that value at existing touch points. So that's another factor that I think is really important in terms of really getting your head around in sort of creating the insurgent mindset. Not surprisingly, because incumbents tend to focus attention on process innovation, as I mentioned before, the organizational paradigm for most incumbents is really about harvesting functional efficiency in vertical command and control hierarchies, which are very efficient ways to manage organizations when particularly things surrounding a firm aren't changing very much. So that functional efficiency, the idea of creating a highly programmed, highly functionalized structure that reports vertically up to a chief executive, where that power structure in the firm is sort of delivered from the top down, is a useful way to organize when you've achieved equilibrium and scale, and as I mentioned, when things don't change very much, but insufficient in a highly dynamic and changing marketplace when the value expressed to the customer may change relatively quickly. So the insurgent mindset here is really about zero distance to the customer, and we call that customer proximity. It's about reducing the lines of communication to the customer and also potentially even bringing the customer, the consumer, into the organizational structure and aiming organizational systems at solving problems for customers in a much more horizontal way that assembles and disassembles talent to achieve, to express and achieve that value to customers. So the horizontal paradigm for managing managing the insurgent firm is fundamentally different than the command and control hierarchical approach that the incumbent brings. And of course, that challenges much or all of what we've learned about how organizational systems work. The reality is that some things are quite stable and benefit from that sort of vertical hierarchical approach, and other things are very dynamic and benefit from a more horizontal approach. But what we're seeing is a major shift to a much more dynamic, much closer to the customer, more customer proximate approach to market engagement and organizational structure. So as leaders, I'd just encourage you to ask the question is, what is our customer proximity? How close to the market, how close to the customer is our firm? And you can literally measure that distance by understanding the degree to which individuals in the firm have meaningful customer contact that then translates into some significant way of generating value. And of course, the most customer proximate organizations will be highly co-creative with customers and consumers, where they're part of the discussion, from the strategy to how customer service is designed, to how value is experienced, to product design, and so forth. And that co-innovation is has a very strong DNA in insurgent organizations. Next, I want to talk about risk and this sort of play not to lose mentality. One of the things that we've studied in terms of how incumbents behave is this unwritten rule of thou shalt not self-cannibalize, which I've always found fascinating, where incumbent firms are willing to allow others to take market share and cannibalize their products, but are almost systematically unwilling to self-cannibalize themselves. And a big reason for that is that incumbents have often an unproductive relationship with risk, where new alternative opportunities are evaluated against the same criteria as, let's call them, incumbent investment opportunities, and therefore opportunities to create early stage value often don't get the oxygen required to nurture and grow new opportunities. Sort of the classic example being the digital camera or the digital film technology in the early days of Kodak. But I know that many or all of you will have experienced these opportunities that have not gotten oxygen because they don't meet certain hurdle rates in your firms. I know even a few of you on this call today are clients of ours, and we've seen that happen, where this relationship with risks, how we measure risk, the KPIs in a firm are very peanut butter in incumbent firms, and often as a result of that sort of one size fits all approach to risk, we tend to forego significant opportunities that might otherwise get oxygen in more dynamic environments. So the play not to lose sort of mentality of the incumbent is something to work really hard against, but as I mentioned earlier, quite difficult. Incumbents are often, not always, but they do seek, as I mentioned before, functional efficiency. And part of that story is to gather up as much of the means of production in a vertically integrated sense as possible to create a situation where more value up and down the value chain can be captured by an existing firm. We saw that in the podcast this morning, where we were looking at CVS and Walgreens, who are vertically integrated upstream in terms of health insurance and PBM, which has created a very, very inflexible architecture for these businesses as that change has kind of come and flooded over them, with challengers like Mark Cuban's pharmacy company and Amazon and others who are attacking that traditional business model in pharmacy. So, these vertical integrated structures can be a benefit. So, for example, in the Tesla SpaceX environment, vertical integration is treated as a benefit because you can control how all these different elements work. So that's an example of two insurgents under one leader who have been very successful in creating a vertically integrated structure. But as competition sort of heats up, we'll see whether that vertical integration creates less agility in these organizations, or whether that a more inflexible creates a more inflexible nature to the architecture of these businesses as new disruption comes along. And eventually those businesses will be challenged, and vertical integration often creates short-term benefits at the expense of long-term benefits. So that's something to think about as well. And of course, insurgents tend to exist in open and networked ecosystems, which really means that they're much more the walls of the firm, the castle, if you will, the moat is less deep, and the by design the walls are shorter. So insurgents tend to seek to connect talent and capability from a variety of sources, cobble these together, and focus in a very narrow way on the things that generate competitive advantage, so that they can adjust and change as those environments evolve. Now, of course, incumbents tend not to have this benefit because, over a period of time, it could be centuries or decades, or these firms have created these moats and walls, and find it very difficult to open up their platforms and business models to connect with other network providers, to create new sources of value. So in many of the companies we observe, the partnerships are very superficial. They're very master slave, in a sense that the firm will have a supplier network. That supplier network will be at arm's length, and downstream partners or technology partners tend to be also arm's length in terms of contractual relationships, which aren't really true partnerships, and don't create an opportunity to imagineer new solutions and opportunities to engage the market, which often creates a very slow way to compete. So I think just this mindset of opening up and reducing the size of the castle walls to allow other firms that have significant capabilities that can plug into your platform, create significant opportunities for insurgents to be much more agile and dynamic, and of course find new opportunities to engage the market. Now, the other thing is, the old Silicon Valley sort of approach of move fast and break things. Well, that may be going too far. Insurgents certainly value speed over perfection. If you've read The Lean Startup, the whole concept of minimum viable product is all about getting to market, discovering with customers what works, and then progressively making investments to grow and scale where those opportunities can be realized. Whereas, I'd say that the incumbent mindset is completely opposite. We tend to find that incumbents will value perfection, or the illusion of perfection, over speed, tend to be too deliberative, don't make decisions very quickly, tend to allocate capital very slowly and in a very measured way, and then consequently, when change and disruption comes, they tend to be very anti-agile. So, if nothing else, learning that, cycle times and lead times are compressing, time to market is getting faster and faster across the economy, and the speed at which these insurgent competitors can kind of spin up to challenge established incumbent firms, at least on the margin, create a situation where that requires a different relationship with time. And insurgents tend to be able to mobilize resources much more quickly than their incumbent counterparts. And my favorite, perhaps, is that the one characteristic above all that the challenger or the insurgent really understands is that the ability to overturn or at least confront obsolete assumptions that incumbents carry deeply within them, and those assumptions often become invisible or embedded, and the inability of the incumbent to surface these assumptions is or even challenge them is deeply disadvantageous to to the incumbent when a combination of market forces combines to undermine a particular set of assumptions. So the classic there is the assumption of taxi license protection in the pre-Uber environment, where for decades or even a century, the incumbent taxi paradigm was really built around the fact that these taxi licenses provided a monopoly that couldn't be challenged, was an assumption that ultimately was able to be challenged and overturned, amongst many others, that significantly undermined a particular industry. And we find that that happens really across the economy. But the problem is the incumbent leader tends to have inherited a set of assumptions that are sort of programmed into a business model from either previous generations of leaders or even startup founders who have grown and scaled over a period of time, tend to be very hard-coded to their original thinking around the business model as they graduate from insurgent to incumbent, and those assumptions become further and further distant. So the insurgent mindset really is about surfacing these assumptions, challenging them, deliberately overturning them, or we describe that as flipping them, and trying to learn or be inspired in an innovation sense about if these assumptions didn't exist, or if we turn them on their head, how would that then invite opportunities to compete a little bit differently? So those assumptions could be about the market, about the customer, about how value is created, about supply chains. It's virtually endless. But in particular, with the advent of AI, many of these assumptions, particularly about how talent works or how capabilities are expressed, those are starting to be undermined as well. So that's a key factor to keep an eye out for. Now, in the podcast that we just released, we did a bit of a compare and contrast between Intel, a classic incumbent, and NVIDIA, the rising star of the microchip market. Now, I won't go into too much detail here, other than to say that Intel enjoyed a almost 70-year sort of monopoly on CPU. That is now giving way to the GPU revolution, which is NVIDIA's combination of luck, but also luck favoring the prepared in terms of being able to turn the GPU paradigm into a new way to compete, combined with software and their Coda platform to create first a supercomputer revolution, and now lay the groundwork for AI, which is really sort of the seminal change that's enabled this AI, where Intel has largely stood on the sidelines of that, and trying to protect their core CPU market has almost given away this market. And recently, the Intel was replaced by NVIDIA on the Dow. It's a very interesting case study. If you want to hear more about that, have a look at our podcast. But suffice it to say that NVIDIA is worth many multiples of Intel now. My prediction is that Intel will be either purchased or broken up in the next 24 months, and they're really struggling to regain their dominance as this change is sort of flooding through the market. And that just gives us an example how a well-established incumbent can really miss the signals in the market and fail to dynamically reinvest in emerging areas at the expense of upstart competitors, in this case, NVIDIA. Another one that we've been tracking, in particular, probably you'd be hard pressed to miss the woes of Boeing, the classic incumbent. And Boeing's story is one of really a systematic lack of customer proximity in the wake of the McDonnell-Douglas merger way back, and the loss of their engineering culture as a result of that. But symbolically moving their headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, is sort of a signal that we're moving closer to the investor and further from the customer. And Boeing really focused at the expense of the customer on shareholder value, internal functional efficiency, share buybacks, all of it. has created a very, very anti-agile business that is now starting to harvest the poisonous fruits of all that sort of approach over 20 years. And we've seen sort of some of the big changes in terms of Boeing's competition with Starliner against Crew Dragon and in their competition with SpaceX. A very famous example where SpaceX was able to get to market not only faster but cheaper in a traditional heartland that Boeing is now. That's commercial space where Boeing is now looking at pulling back and perhaps selling that division. So SpaceX has largely come out of nowhere with a completely different paradigm for competition, and at the expense of really at the expense of everybody. But Boeing has borne a significant brunt of that competition, and I would submit that companies like Intel and Boeing, their inflexibility and their sort of deliberate incumbent mindset has worked against them, and it's really a choice to be disrupted if the opportunities are available to you to think differently, to express value differently. So in Australia in particular, this is a chart here that describes some of the big capital raises last year. And in contrast to previous years, what we're seeing now is this capital is being spread more and more across the economy. You can see here that some of these companies have a very strong technology approach to them, but we have satellites, we have carbon, we have payments, we have operating systems for theme parks, we have employee management, we have pain management, we have pets. So, these are the top 10 deals from 2023 in terms of capital raising. But what we're seeing is a much more dynamic sort of approach to allocating capital in Australia, which is still well behind our North American counterparts. But this dynamic sort of investment is creating these new insurgents that are now getting real money to upset and challenge their incumbent counterparts across the economy, which I think is really exciting. Why does it all matter? Basically, all the change surrounding our firms and in the macroeconomic and political environment are so significant and so fast that leaders that are not hedging their bets by working with their C-level or C-suite partners, with their emerging leaders and rank and file to start building these cultures and mindsets are ones that will be at a disadvantage. And I submit that the change is so quick that unless you're making this investment in building these mindsets, you'll find it virtually impossible to shift quickly enough to address the disruption when it comes, let alone take advantage of all the opportunities available to you to seek new sources of value, new business models, and to disrupt your peers. So how can I embrace the insurgent mindset? So first, recognize that the incumbent mindsets are the default. That's if you do nothing, you will fall into the incumbent mindset. Very few people are programmed to be insurgents, so you have to work very hard at it. You have to also understand that your organizational system will work against this, both actively and passively, to undermine the insurgents, both internally and externally. So we all know those people inside our firms that are agitating for change, but the DNA tends to, the antibodies, if you will, tends to attack those individuals. Without deliberate and intentional leadership, insurgent mindsets are difficult to master. So it is a choice. We have to build this muscle and we have to build this capability. If we don't, we'll default back to the incumbent mindsets. I think the first step is to educate your teams to discover what the insurgent mindset means to you, to really understand, the degree of stability in your environment. What are you vulnerable to? And to unpack your assumptions about competition, customers, et cetera. And, is to sort of bring all that together to, really start to build a culture of challenger and insurgent, but a culture that also captures, if you will, some of the advantages of the incumbent, because we could do another podcast or another webinar on that, but there are certain incumbent advantages that we don't want to walk away from. So finally, how can we help? I think we've created a series of programs to work with firms to work on three different levels. One is to program or to work with senior leaders, the C-suite, if you will, to help them learn how to lead this type of innovation and to cultivate and nurture the insurgent mindset. The second is to work with emerging leaders in a firm to help them build these mindsets and to learn how to compete differently through a set of um, it's where psychology meets methodology and looking at ways to both innovate and to discover new sources of value. And we also have program infrastructure to work with coaches and catalysts inside the firm in particular to help them engage their peers and colleagues throughout the organization so that these concepts can scale. So we find that really helpful. And if you're interested in learning more, please reach out to us. For more information, you can reach out to me directly, and I'll look forward to hearing your feedback about the webinar, and certainly let us know if we can help.